right, I can see our participants ticking up. Welcome, everybody. Gonna give it just a minute here for people to trickle in. All right, welcome everyone. Once again, I'm Gordon Douglas. I'm the director of the Institute for Metropolitan Studies at San Jose State. Thank you for joining us for the second of these sessions that we have organized with our colleagues at the Human Rights Institute at San Jose State for a whole series of events on social housing in America. This is the second one. Yesterday, we had an awesome conversation with Assembly Member Alex Lee. Hope you were able to join us for that. Today we'll be talking with some folks. And then on Friday, we've got the third of these events at 2 p.m. So I'm going to put the link in the chat again in just a second. Please register for all of these if you can. And all of them will be recorded and made available on our website. That we're setting up with a whole bunch of cool resources and links and kind of research tools and things like that for learning more about social housing. So look out for that in the next week or so. Also, I just want to say thanks to everybody for being here and for making this possible, especially my colleague Lou Jimenez, who has done a ton to get the website put together and set up all these events. So without further ado, I am going to pass this off to my friend and colleague, Alex Shafran, who is our Institute for Metropolitan Studies Fellow and a renowned scholar of housing and politics in Northern California. He's the author of The Road to Resegregation, among other books and studies. So go check his work out too. Alex, take it away, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure about the renowned scholar part, but I'm very happy to be playing the role of Bobby Fleckman, the hostess with the mostest here today, with two of my favorite human beings in this space, people who I think really are pushing the boundaries of what's possible, of how to think it, how to be thoughtful actors in this space that also are not afraid to actually do things and are not just going to sit behind their word or behind the pen or behind their Twitters, but are actually out in the world trying to make the housing futures that I think that we all want to see real. So just a few housekeeping notes before I do my introductions and toss the baton and the mic over to both Daniel and Shanti. One is that unfortunately, there is an emergency involving trying to get a bunch of tenants back on a bus in Albany, New York, who need to get back home to downstate or various places where they live. And so we are hoping that Sia Weaver will still be able to join us maybe at the end of the program. If not, we offer our apologies and a promise that we will do our best to bring Sia and her work and all of the work that is being done in other parts of the countries back to SJSU and to the IMS in the future. So you may see Sia Weaver appear in the middle of the conversation, you might not, but either way, we appreciate it. And again, we appreciate all your patience. we're all doing this live. Everything is these days live, Zoom. It happens in the middle of real life. And I hope that people are patient with us and understand, your tickets were to this, we're still free. So apologize for that. Number two is again, just a reminder that we have our final event in Social Housing Week coming up on Friday at 2 p.m. featuring the fantastic Gordon Douglas, the amazing Prentice Danzler from the University of Toronto, the amazing Karen Chappell, formerly of UC Berkeley and now the University of Toronto as well, and Alejandra Reyes from UC Irvine, talking about social housing in context, right? All of our academic friends coming together to really try to interpret and understand how we can think about social housing in the history of US housing. How do we think about it in the history of housing movements, in the history of public housing, in the history of affordable housing, and the history of academic research around housing. And I think it will be a good event for students, I think for fellow academics and for non-academics to really deepen our understanding about social housing. And that in many ways, as we mentioned yesterday, is the focus of the Institute for Metropolitan Studies. We're in the process of rebuilding and rebirthing this institution that has been around for quite some time, around helping Californians in particular understand how California gets made. It's a very pedagogical approach. It's really trying to find ways to deepen our understanding of what is a very complex and difficult set of systems like housing. And we chose social housing because in some ways, not only because it's something that inspires us politically, but it's also something that requires a full understanding of housing to really be able to understand it. There's a lot of ways of kind of misunderstanding what people are wanting. People want different things when they talk about social housing. And so we really offer up this week of events and the resource or research archive that we are putting together that will hopefully be available at the end of next week, along with the videos from these events, as a way for students and activists and researchers and teachers and scholars to do their own homework, to really dig in and learn and engage, do your own critical analysis of what people are saying, find your own pathway when it comes to understanding this, and sort of build on the work of others in this space. And we hope to be able to do this for similar issues, including very mundane, even more kind of wonkish and mundane issues like civic data infrastructure, where hopefully we'll be making some announcements in the next couple of weeks about some upcoming events in that space. So we're really excited again about what we're hoping to be able to do. Please, if you have ideas or thoughts or questions for the Institute, for Gordon and myself about where we're going or what we're hoping to do, or if you have ideas about potential partnerships, please get in touch. Let us know, especially if you have ideas on how to raise money. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the game. And then third housekeeping note is the chat is enabled and live, but please, for the Q&A, to make my life easier, put your questions in the Q&A. You can do so as soon as you go, as soon as you have them, and we'll go until probably about 1 o'clock, and then we will take the Q&A period from that. And like I said last night, and I will always say, if for some reason we don't get to your question today, we'll make sure that the panelists all get your questions, and we'll figure out some sort of way of getting an answer, perhaps out in public on our website or in some other way. Okay, so thank you again all for coming. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you Shanti Singh and Danielle Aldana Cohen. Shanti is the legislative director at Tenants Together. This is the New York statewide tenants' rights coalition here in the state of California. She's also a member of the Oversight board for I have to get this right. I always have to read this, Shanti, before I mix it. It's the San Francisco Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board. And I'll let Shanti explain more about it. But in this role, she is a really active and important member of a board overseeing public monies. And one of the ways that many members of the board would like to see this money used is to set up a local social housing program in the city and county of San Francisco, which is where I was born. And I'm very happy to see that in the city of my grandparents, something like this is happening. Danielle Aldana Cohen is a sociology professor at UC Berkeley. He's part of the Climate and Community Project and is well known for folks who have been paying attention to the hopes and possibilities and dreams and policy recommendations of the Green New Deal here in the United States, whether you're getting them through Bernie or through AOC or through any other number of sources. Daniel has been a really sort of central part of that thinking for a long time. Somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about all issues related to climate and equity in the United States, and in particular the Green New Deal framework, and brings a lot of knowledge and information about things going on elsewhere. So if yesterday was about Alex Lee's bill and the social housing bill in California, today we're going to kind of do two things. We're going to partly, I think, spend some time down on the ground in some of the communities like San Francisco that are trying to do these things at the local level. And Daniel and Shanti will also sort of think broadly about, I think, this point in the United States and how we understand social housing, especially from movement spaces, from activist spaces, from housing justice spaces, and how we go from there. Without further ado, Daniel and Shanti, thank you so much both to you for being here. It's a real pleasure, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having us. Which one of us do you want to go first?
Oh, I think, I mean, Shanti, I think, you know, as the person coming from the great city and county, the floor should certainly be yours.
All right. Thank you. Yes. That's what people love, a little more San Francisco arrogance. Just kidding. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm really, really excited to be here. As Alex explained, I am the legislative director for Tenants Together. We are a statewide coalition of 50, I think we've cracked 50 tenants' rights organizations and housing justice groups and legal aid organizations across the great state of California. And I also happen to chair, a public body called the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board, which is it's 100% public membership body that's trying to find ways to make recommendations, like financial recommendations, to actually start piloting, building, acquiring, managing social housing in the city and county of San Francisco. So yeah, I do have a couple, I'm gonna get into a couple things. One, sort of what we're doing in San Francisco, but also kind of trying to ground that a little bit in I am a socialist, I have to say that up front. So I have to ground it in a little bit of socialist history, but also talk about, this will be accessible to non-socialists, but talk a little bit also about, what it is, how the tenant movement across the state and locally is engaging with social housing. What are the questions that we're asking ourselves that, that we have settled? What are the questions that we're asking ourselves that we have not settled or come to agreement upon? Because I think they're going to very much inform this statewide fight and the statewide discussion that's been initiated, has been building up for a while, but right now is taking form in Assemblymember Lee's bill. So I'll get right into it. But a couple of things, before I start, there's been a lot of engagement, and I'll kind of be reflecting a lot of the conversations that I've been having with tenant organizers, tenants themselves, and tenant groups across the state, in how we've been doing a ton of internal discussion, political education, all of that work that I've kind of been doing in my day job, but also outside my day job. So I'm hoping that what I say is going to be mostly informed by that. But, one of the big things we've been discussing is, and I know because the first word that people are going to throw out, of course, is Vienna, right? We're all talking about Vienna. But, kind of the way that we're conceptualizing it too is thinking about it in terms of, how was Red Vienna won? And I'm going to drop a little hint here. There's a little bit of the red part there that matters. And I think that's really relevant and important to how we're going to think about how we're going to fund social housing, but also how we're going to defend it as a political program. As others have pointed out, the most successful welfare state programs that have survived in the United States are the universally popular ones, right? So from an organizing perspective, we're also thinking about what it takes to make this popular, but also what it takes, financially to make it work. And so when we think about Rev Vienna, of course, and we think about Vienna social housing, there was progressive taxation. I think a lot of people are fans of that. There was acquisition. There was a little bit of expropriation. We had a system where rents covered mostly operational costs, which is very different from the current system in a way that I think that that really appeals to tenants, because it's not a system in which working class people are subjected to onerous means testing that often, unfortunately, lets a lot of people fall through the cracks. So that's actually something, a promise of social housing potentially that appeals to tenant groups. And so when we think about how social housing has been won, it's been won by tenant movements, it's been won by workers movements, it's been won by progressive coalitions, sometimes, yes, socialist coalitions. But, as an enduring political program, I think that's kind of what we think about as tenant groups when we're thinking about what are the lessons from, say, Vienna that has allowed their social housing to endure. There are other people, not to say I don't love digging into financial models. I do love spreadsheets, but the angle that we're taking to it is thinking about what was the political power actually required to win an enduring social housing program. So that's kind of, I think, where the tenant movements have been at least in, my discussions with all of our member organizations, my discussions in San Francisco. There's an idea that heavy state investment in social housing is not just about financing, which I know like a lot of critics of welfare state programs in the United States always ask the perennial question, quote unquote, how will you pay for it? But I think the way that we think about it is part of a broader, that state investment in social housing is part of a broader political demand that the state prioritize caring for its people, and that they absolutely can pay for it in context of some of maybe the harmful systems that the government pays for now, right? It's not like our spending priorities of our existing budgets are amazing. So, and that creates a political opportunity, I do think, to, if we're going to win social housing in California or in the United States, we're going to have to win that in coalition. It can't just be us wonderful housing nerds all the time. There's so many opportunities. I'm sure Daniel will get to the environmental justice piece because he's the Green New Deal expert. I am not. But also working with divestment and like thinking about divestment and reinvestment advocates, thinking about public bank advocates, thinking about organized labor is incredibly important because this is housing for workers. People who are working on the front lines with policing and prisons, et cetera. There are so many opportunities here because housing is such a core issue to everybody. To actually build a coalition that's going to, of tenants, of workers, of advocates, et cetera, that's actually going to deliver a program that will, stand the test of time. And so, and there are the other thing too that I want to point out, but I'm going to get back to this later, I think, is that there are also, a lot of social housing programs in the global South, in a lot of different countries that aren't necessarily in Europe that are also pioneering very exciting and inspiring models. So definitely the history of Vienna is something that the socialists think about, certainly. And it's a very it's a very impressive program that we can look to in terms of building what we can now, but there's also other models everywhere. But I'm going to put a pin in that. And I think Daniel might have something to say about that. I'm not entirely sure. But I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit, drill down a little bit into what's been happening in San Francisco. So kind of how this all sort of kicked off was that, I'm sure California folks may be familiar with Article 34, but if you're not, it's a very racist initiative, started as a citizens initiative, but is now like baked into the California Constitution since, I want to say 1950. I might get the exact year wrong. But Article 34 basically forces you to, anytime you're authorizing any kind of housing construction that's more than 50% public money, you have to have a ballot referendum to approve it, which often allows localities to shoot that housing down. Fortunately, that hasn't been historically a problem in the past with San Francisco, which is good. I think we like affordable housing. I think at this point, we think we need more of it. So about in 2020, yes, we approved an Article 34 authorization called Prop K. What was different about Prop K that was different from past authorizations is it explicitly in the language includes an option for municipal ownership. So that's like not even step one, that's like step zero, right? But that passed at the ballot overwhelmingly. But concurrent with that was something more controversial, which was Prop I, which was a real estate transfer tax, to pay for social housing, and that faced a tremendous amount of opposition. It was on properties over 10 million, I want to say. It faced a lot of heavy opposition. It was outspent 15-1. But the message was still compelling enough that it was approved by, I believe, a little over 58% of voters, despite being heavily outspent. And so that created the financing source. But that financing source was what was able, that instigated, as part of the ballot measure, the establishment of this housing stability fund, right? Now, you can have a fund and not put money in it, and that's the battle that we're going to get to, that I'm going to get to shortly. But it created the fund, and then it created, an oversight body of the members of the public to recommend to actually what to do with the money in the fund. Now, we don't have the authority to spend that money. I wish I did, but I don't. But as chair of that body, what we've been really trying to do is convene, start having the same kind of engagement process that we've been having, that, like, say I might be having in my day job, but like having it on a much bigger scale with the community groups, with labor, with like current affordable housing providers, with all these different parties across the state, to get together and say, okay, with land trusts, like what does social housing at least look to us in San Francisco, and start building something out from there, both in terms of short-term recommendations, but building towards a long-term future vision where we actually do want to be building Vienna style social housing in the city of San Francisco. But so it's like, how do we help people now? How do we help tenants now? But then also, how do we lead to that bigger vision? And so that's kind of how we as the board see our responsibilities, and see like what we're the process that we're trying to go through with the public and engaging the public is really about that. Now, in terms of our, we have to put out a round of budget recommendations every March. So we just did our absolute first one ever, which I'm hoping it won't be the last. I'm hoping there'll be many more to come. But we're talking about a variety of tools, whether it's acquiring land, like land banking, funding studies for hopefully to start working on this like bigger Vienna style housing issue, to acquire rent controlled housing that's currently under threat during COVID by the speculative market. So it really is like a panoply of like very short term to very long term actions. And of course, trying to find the ways that we can sort of tie those together into an ecosystem, a portfolio of social housing across the city, instead of kind of thinking about it like this building is X% affordable, that building is X% affordable. But there's going to be political headwinds to that, if I can be totally honest. The system by which we control budgets, and especially in a city like San Francisco, we're very lucky to have a $10 billion budget. That's not a budget a lot of cities have the luxury of working with, but it's also a heavily politicized process, right? And it's sometimes there are elements of what a budget discussion or what a budget fight is that is kind of antithetical to building a stable foundation that is going to last year after year after year, a stable social housing system. You can't be fighting over that in the budget forever, every single year. That's not how it should be done, or at least in my opinion. And so getting buy-in from all of the different parties, of course, this is a new concept to a lot of people. There's going to be skepticism from some folks with entrenched power. I'm being vague on purpose. But, we were able to have our city council or our board of supervisors, which is the same as our city council in San Francisco. They did manage to approve $64 million in spending by basically overriding a threat of a mayoral veto. So we just got that veto-proof majority, but it's still going to be a challenge to get the money actually spent. And, we're kind of in the middle of that right now, especially because budget season is upon us. But, we as board members don't get to direct any of this money. We're not, lobbying for specific organizations. We're not allowed to do any of that. We're just providing these broader recommendations and hoping that folks will step up and organize around them, especially after going through this intensive process of, actually putting together recommendations that reflect what the public wants, what labor wants, what community wants. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we are. It's very nascent. I'm sure state level efforts and state agency to help facilitate that would be enormously helpful. But that's a bit about what we're doing in San Francisco. I don't know how long I've been going, but at some point I was going to get into at least what, more about what tenants and organizers are kind of saying, but I can stop there and break it up. It's up to you.
Thanks so much, Shanti. I'm about to go on an epic rant, so I think if there's anything else you wanted to get out.
All right, let me finish up. Okay. Daniel's epic rant. Okay, give me 1 second. I got to finish mine too. So, in terms of like, I was kind of hoping, I do hope Sia still hops on, because it would be nice if she could chime in, because this is something Sia and I talk about a lot. But there's a few things, and here's my laundry list. We need to really talk about defending and protecting existing public housing and public housing tenants, and incorporating that into the discussion of social housing, so that we don't accidentally create a two-tiered system where we're leaving existing public housing and public housing tenants behind. Many of Tenants Together's members organizations still, organize public housing. They still, like, a lot of the public housing in San Francisco has mostly been sort of privatized through like RAD and HOPE and other programs. But that doesn't mean that it's not like it's not a critical and important issue even now in SF, but it's an even more important issue in other parts of the state or the country, particularly in New York. I think there's an understandable temptation among some advocates, which is completely, I sympathize with it, right? Given the stigma that public housing has carried, and that it's been given, I would say intentionally, over decades and decades of, redlining, segregation, disinvestment, all of that, there is a temptation, and there's a place to say, well, this is different, but it's got to build on, not necessarily, like, I don't like to frame it as the mistakes of public housing in the past. I like to frame it as actually the way in which public housing was perennially, like, repeatedly betrayed. And kind of think about it, like, to us, I think, us talking about like tenant organizers, tenant groups, et cetera, they have to be part of the same ecosystem. So we want social housing to also support existing public housing. That's really important. And it still houses something like 2 million people in this country, more. I forgot the exact number. For that reason, a lot of times, even when I'm speaking to people, I catch myself doing this at like dinner parties. Like, I almost use public and social housing interchangeably. That's also to square the points that people have brought up about land trusts, acquisition, other strategies, which also, like, as an aside, I forgot to say this, but I am like also a voluntary position, vice president of the board of the San Francisco Community Land Trust. So I do care a lot about land trusts. But we want to have that big umbrella where we can talk about things like CLTs, where we can, again, community land trusts, not cross-laminated timber, but also, trying to make sure that nobody forgets that public housing is social housing. And so I'm always kind of awkwardly shoehorning social and public housing, or public and social housing together, to incorporate all of these things that I'm kind of trying to say in this phrase, so that's part of it. Some other quick notes from our conversations that I've had with our members, right? And with our tenants is very much, the thing that appeals to them about the Vienna model is that it was one with heavy government investment. It was prioritizing the most insecurely housed workers, and building the mixed income solidarity rent model out from there. And of course, that there was no excessive means testing, which allowed the mixed income model to flourish, because then once you got in, if you ended up making more money, or, moving up in life a little bit, maybe partly because you didn't have to pay exorbitant rents, that you would stay there, and that you would want to stay there, right? It's also, we know that tenants are always going to have to be able to struggle and organize, including in social and public and cooperatively owned housing, right? The right to organize isn't just something that's for the private housing market. It's important for social housing as well. One thing I've really picked up on is a lot of opposition to, like, this is going to get controversial, but don't shoot the messenger, but opposition to investor privatization and public-private partnerships. because sometimes downstream of that, like it's created sometimes like important outcomes and built housing that people desperately need. But a lot of times tenants have really struggled with the power imbalances that these financing models can create, right? When it comes to things like deed restrictions expiring, et cetera, et cetera. So overall, I guess where we diverge, if I can be completely honest, from other social housing advocates, we're not mad, we're not beefing, but where we diverge from other advocates who are maybe a little more focused on the cross subsidy model, which again, we do think the solidarity rent model is good. But we also think that it's going to be necessary for this to be a popular program that people will defend, for this to be an enduring program, for this to survive all of the, vicissitudes of like American austerity brain, that we can't really do this successfully without some sort of political confrontation with the state that's created a lot of our other inequities that are not just in housing, but that touch on the issue of housing. So that is kind of how we're thinking about it. It is a bigger long-term struggle because we have to say, like, yes, the state can pay for this. We can actually have an economy that prioritizes our basic human needs, including housing. So, that's, I think, going to feed into later, and I'll get into this later, but, maybe in the Q&A, but that is also kind of feeding into how we understand the concept of revenue neutrality, which is why I was going on that long-winded loop to bring it back to revenue neutrality. But, the point of the project is like, we are ready to fight for what we think social housing really means and what the potential it has to be. But of course, like, we can't do this fight alone as tenant advocates. None of us can do this fight alone. Like, we're going to have to build a real coalition, and it's going to take some time and a lot of work and a lot of fighting. That's it.
Yes, thank you, Shanti. So invigorating. And no bullshit fake solutions allowed. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about my perspective on this, and then to kind of go back and forth a little bit, because Shanti, you were in the trenches and I am like in a blimp, just like coasting over in my little academic bubble, but with access to the internet and the phone and all that. Okay, so my name is Aldana Cohen. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Berkeley. Thank you, Alex, for the kind introduction. I have studied housing and climate politics for over a decade, largely doing fieldwork in New York City and Sao Paulo. And in the last few years, I've also got involved in housing policy. I'm on the policy team of the Homes Guarantee campaign, which was a national sort of association of tenants movements. I led the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, which AOC and Bernie introduced in Congress in 2019, again in 2021. And by the way, if we ever pass Build Back Better, there are $65 billion in it for public housing, which no way in hell that would have ever happened without the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act and the pressure that AOC puts on Chuck Schumer. So it's very good to have those two people in the same city. So I've advised various politicians on green housing policies, movements. I'm trying very hard to be a good allied wonk. But again, at the end of the day, what really matters is what is coming out of the tenant movement, the movements themselves, the folks in those movements. And I think my job of people like me is to bring the expertise to the table, and then to see what the movements say to correct those apprehensions and how they want to move forward. And I do want to point out, the flagship demand I've been pushing, 12 million units of new social housing in 10 years, comes out of the Homes Guarantee movement. And it comes out of a set of meetings and the kind of founding of that organization when people like Tara Raghavir, a great friend of mine who organizes Casey Tenants, went to tenants and said, what do we want? What's our demand? And the tenants said, we have to go big, we have to go bold. So those aren't numbers I pulled from the sky. I'm embarrassed that I used to ask for only 10 million units of social housing, but the number's been upped by tenants who are fighting in the trenches. Okay, what is the overall context as I see it for a case for social housing, and in particular, a case for green social housing? I think we just have to recognize the enormity of the need that we face from solely a housing perspective, and then let's talk about climate. We have a shortage of in the neighborhood of 7 million units of housing right now, affordable housing for people on low and especially extremely low incomes. We have something in the neighborhood of 20 million people in the country paying over a third of their income in rent, about 20 million homeowners well, on the way to being homeowners, I guess, spending over a third of their income on monthly payments. Of that, approximately 40 million, about half of those people are paying over half their income in monthly housing payments. So that is a gigantic crisis. I mean, we don't have like 20 billion households in the United States. You know, we are talking about tens of millions of people who basically cannot afford to pay their bills. Speaking of, let's talk about utility bills. 1/3 of Americans before COVID in 2016, the last time this was counted, 1/3 of Americans could not afford their energy bills. What does that mean? That within the prior 12 months, either they received a utility disconnect notice, or they sacrificed on essentials to cover their utility bills, or they kept their home at an unsafe temperature. The energy crisis, the affordability crisis, the climate crisis are converging in Americans' homes. That's 1/3 of Americans overall. 1/2 of Black Americans across the country cannot afford their utility bills. This is a massive, massive crisis that we are just living with every day. Now, all of this is set to get worse under conditions of climate breakdown, never mind the speculative frenzy in the housing market. Work by Matt Hauer, who's the best climate demographer I know of, he's pointed out that, you know, by the end of the century, under a modest amount of sea level rise, modest to high, you could have 13 million people who are now projected to live in land that would be underwater. So you could say, oh, there's going to be 13 million climate migrants within the US, but you don't just move when you're underwater. He's also finding about 40 million households are projected to live on land that would flood at least once a year. So I'm not sure that people are going to want to stick around there either. So people have this kind of catastrophizing discourse about climate migrants, you know, hordes of people rushing north, blah, blah, blah. What we're going to see are 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 great migration scale movements just within the United States, not even counting all the people who should be coming into this country as well. The Great Migration was 6 million people. The emancipatory promise was broken by Jim Crow, and in many ways hardened what sociologists call American apartheid. So we're gonna have a lot of people on the move. It's gonna get a lot hotter. People already can't afford the rent, already can't afford the energy bills. There's a huge, huge, huge need to change the housing system. There's no way in hell that the meager tax credit funding is gonna work. Wildly underfunded housing choice vouchers are not going to work. Giving people a discount on their mortgage payment will work well for upper middle class families. That's who's being benefited, but nobody else. Basically, the bottom half of the country is completely ill-served by our housing system. So we do need big, big, big change. And in addition to that, we need a housing system that tackles the root causes of climate change, carbon pollution, and that makes people safe from the impacts of climate change, heat, wildfire smoke, hurricanes, storms, flooding, etc. So that to me is really the case. If there were no other case for green social housing, that is it. We're fighting a climate emergency. We're fighting an emergency of housing insecurity. This obviously will require massive levels of investment. And by the way, if the United States spent an additional $1 trillion a year in green investments, including on housing, that would put the US public investment as a share of its economy roughly in the middle of where the OECD average, of the average of rich countries in the world. So the United States federal government could pump an extra $1 trillion every single year in green infrastructure spending. And that would not even make the United States a big spender on the global scale. It would bring the US to the level of the Netherlands. Anyways, jokes about the Netherlands aside, we probably want to go even further. Okay, so what is the answer to all this? In my view, of course, the answer is green social housing that would provide shelter to people, fight climate change, create generations of new skilled labor in the green economy. What is social housing? Okay, now nobody has a monopoly on that definition, but here's what Mark Paul, an economist, and I argued recently. For us, social housing is defined as a housing system that incorporates affordable community services like childcare and dentistry into its developments, so it's mixed use. It offers homes to the working and the middle classes, so it's mixed income. It's governed with more resident involvement than traditional public housing has been. And of course, we're going to be fighting climate change by building no carbon housing with green materials. Now, I want to add to that. I think the best way to think about social housing is that it is not something that is defined at the level of the building, but defined at the level of the housing ecology. I think community land trusts are also social housing. Limited equity co-ops, which means that when you come buy in and out of the cooperative, you're not paying market rate, but you're paying basically the rate that you paid to get in, which is subsidized plus interest when you leave. Those are also social housing. We could talk about many, many different additional models of social housing. To me, what unites them is the intimate relationship with democracy and community and holistic services, and that these are housing units that are insulated from the savagery of the land market. So the monthly costs are going to go well below the market rate. There's going to be very strong protections from eviction, which, by the way, tax credit housing has been found not to actually have. But again, I don't think we want to say, is this building social or not? Does this building have a dental clinic inside of it? We want to say, does this ecology have these things? And so Shanti mentioned, we have existing public housing. I don't think we should say, oh, we got to move in 50% middle income people to make that mixed income housing. It's got to be brought into a broader portfolio. Those tenants 100% protected. If they want to move into a more spacious apartment across the street, great. But fundamentally, this is about an ecology that's going to have different kinds of tenure types, but will be insulated from the land market. Okay, this is the big case. I just want, as a flag, obviously we also need rent control. That is also, by the way, green policy. Right now, green investment comes into a neighborhood and residents fear rightly that that could spur displacement as the landlord jacks up the rent. Some of the hottest gentrifying neighborhoods in the country are environmental justice communities, where people have cleaned up the environment and now the speculators are coming in. But this is a conversation about rent, about social housing, but let it be clear, rent control 100%. It's my position, it's the position of everybody that I work with. One last kind of quick note before I step back for a minute. This is also industrial policy, and I think it's important to point that out. Housing is a big part of the economy. Half the world's wealth is held in housing. Housing is a big part of the American economy. Homes produce somewhere between a sixth and a fifth of US carbon emissions. A new home building program will also be a program of transforming appliances, of upgrading the skills of workers. Will create a massive ecology of green firms. In Paris, they build social housing with hempcrete, concrete mixed with hemp, which reduces the carbon footprint of the concrete and has all these amazing insulating benefits. Social housing policy is also a chance to leverage public investment to develop the kind of green high road economy that we all want. And like, as much as that builds towards socialism, the happier, the more it builds towards socialism, the happier I'll be. But you don't have to get to full socialism to have a really brilliant green industrial policy vision for social housing, which is going to be great for workers, great for communities, and might even be a non-reformist reform. But Shanti is a critic of the excessive use of that term. Okay, what makes me even think that this is possible? How am I not just spinning out a science fiction story? Who can even be allowed to say such things out loud and not get laughed out of the room? So some lessons. First, let me start with Sao Paulo, where I've done some research so far. I think what you see in Brazil, what you see in Sao Paulo, is that a lot of the things we find here to be contradictions or difficult, if not impossible, are happening already. And if they can happen there, why not here? A few years ago, I was lucky enough to visit a social housing project in construction at a really cool time. The development was not finished. It was kind of halfway done. And the residents were allowed to come in and see the apartments that they were going to get to move into. Hilariously, they had put cardboard cutouts of the appliances in place so that the residents, so there was like a 1/4 inch thick fridge with a picture of it, 1/4 inch thick TV. So the residents could kind of get a sense of what they were moving into. They were like incredibly happy. But there were some other interesting things about this development. It was named after Nelson Mandela and Frei Beto, so both an international icon of anti-racist struggle and a liberation theology priest who was very important in building up the left in Sao Paulo. This was a combination of public funding for the housing development and then direction on all aspects of the project from the movement itself. So you can have public investment and movement involvement at the same time. This is a model that exists in Brazil, should be expanded, but it already exists. And then finally, the relationship between housing and a broader set of movements over land. So this movement, this housing project has a very strong ecological orientation. One of the most interesting things about it, I think, is that they're planning to hold markets where the landless peasants movement, the MST, will be selling kind of low-cost organic produce to the residents of this housing. Now, I think AOC was sometimes mocked when saying that in her Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, you could get low-cost organic groceries on the ground floor. I don't know why you would mock AOC for just trying to catch up with what they're doing in the suburbs of Sao Paulo. A couple other things that I think are worth pointing out that have been done in Sao Paulo and that are relevant here. There's a specific zoning code in Sao Paulo called the ZACE 3 from the 2002 master plan, which specifically designates the right of working class people to live in specially zoned areas in the downtown. Now, I'm not talking about like a 6-block radius, but they are zoning 4 buildings for working class public housing in the downtown. And that is a specific zoning code, which recognizes that we're not just zoning for public housing, but we're specifically zoning for public housing in the most central areas, because that is a historic demand of the housing movement, for people to be able to live downtown, near where they work, near where they get their services. Not the only place where they want to live, but an important one. And the other thing that they've done in Sao Paulo, and we'll see what happens with the new master plan that's being debated right now, but the one passed in the 2010s with housing movement support included what I call AETOD, actually equitable transit-oriented development. And what that meant was zoning for public housing all along the axes of densification and public transit investment. And what's more, specifying a specific set aside from developer fees into a fund that would support affordable housing. And among the governors of that fund were several representatives of the housing movement. And that money is already being used in part to expropriate abandoned buildings from their delinquent property owners so that they can be converted to social housing. So the idea that there's some kind of like, oh, we can't use zoning tools. Oh, movements can never shape the direction of public housing. Oh, well, if we do, equitable transit-oriented development, it's going to have this or that relationship to land. You can do creative planning, and housing movements can be intimately involved in the policy process. So there's a lot for us to learn from cities in the global south. And that said, let me just say a little bit about Vienna. My heart, always flutters when Vienna comes up. I want to add a few more things to the points that Shanti made. Red, yes. The Social Democratic Party was elected for the first time in 1919 in Vienna. They have literally not lost an election since. They were defeated in a civil war by Nazis. They have never lost an election. And their single defining policy for 100 years has been to build spectacular public housing, called social housing really, where the best architects competed for the right to build this extraordinary housing. Initially, this was done through confiscatory taxes on the rich. The top 0.5% wealthiest properties paid 40% of the property tax. They also funded about 30% of the initial social housing with luxury taxes on things like champagne, racehorses, and servants. The first servant was tax exempt, but the second servant on was taxable. This was not like a rosy situation. The Hugo Beitner, the financier, the banker who became Red Vienna's finance minister, was called a tax sadist. Robert Dannenberg, who was the political architect of Red Vienna's housing system, was ultimately murdered in a Nazi concentration camp. This was seen as an existential fight. The public housing that was built by Red Vienna became known as voter blocks, derisively, red fortresses. And when the fascists beat the left in a civil war in the 1930s, the last holdout of the left was the social housing complexes. The Karl Marx-Hof, the most spectacular of these housing complexes, was literally shelled into submission. So I think it is appropriate actually to think and to understand that the fight over housing is a kind of existential fight between the left and the right. Half of the world's wealth is in housing. It will not actually be that easy to take a lot of that land back and to put social non-market housing on it. There's another important feature of Viennese social housing that I think actually relates to the Bay and to many other US cities. One of the reasons that this happened is that in 1919, after World War I, Austria and Hungary separated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken in half. Hungary had the coal, Austria had factories. And the coal was expensive, of course. They sold selling to Austria, it was expensive. So Vienna had this, so Austria entirely actually had this problem. They were like, how do we make our exports competitive when our major input, coal, is so expensive? And they were like, well, that's going to destroy our export industry unless we radically reduce workers' wages. So we got to cut workers' wages. Now, if we do that, the workers are going to be really pissed off. So how are we going to get away with slashing workers' wages? Well, what they decided was actually the landlord is going to eat it. So they passed rent control nationally. They set the rent for the initial social housing at about 3% of a semi-skilled worker's salary. And they fundamentally made a decision. We have an alliance of productive, basically productive people, factory owners and tenants and politicians, and the landlords are going to eat it. And I think there are questions that have been raised in the US. How can you have a productive economy when every worker is being shunted to the farthest, vastest reaches of the urban peripheries because of the land market? Well, maybe really high rent for landowners is not the top priority in a society. Maybe our top priority is fighting climate change and making sure that people can live near where they work and near their services. So one of the key lessons in Vienna was that someone's got to eat this like higher cost of doing business, and landlords are going to eat it. And it was very easy ultimately for them to polarize against landlords, easy enough that they were reelected in every single election that they have ever fought. In the first decade of Red Vienna, they built housing for 10% of the city's working class, 64,000 units housing 200,000 people. The housing complexes that they've built had things inside them like dentistry clinics, laundries, state-run interior decorating consultancies, social clubs, and on and on and on. For, as Eve Blau puts it in her history of Red Vienna's social housing, the housing program was the Viennese Social Democrats' urban program. It was their industrial policy program. It was the way that they created jobs for skilled craftspeople. It was how they fundamentally produced space in their city. And again, it has turned the entirety of Vienna into a kind of social housing temple. Today, about a quarter to a third of the housing is social housing, and about 2/3 of the housing is off of the market. Vienna is routinely ranked the best city in the world to live in. Now, social housing is largely funded by the rents from the housing and from a very modest income tax shared by employers and employees. So this is a program that has lasted. It has lasted. What is the difference between social housing and public housing in the United States? Well, a lot of that answer can be found in this history. The model in Vienna, a social housing model, mixed use, mixed income, Shanti talked about that as well, integrated into the community. There was a version of that model being pushed in the United States at that time in the 1930s. And a couple different groups were pushing for it. One was the Public Works Administration. They were trying to build good, high quality, mixed income housing, and the real estate industry hated it because they did not want to have to compete with good, high quality, state developed housing. Another person, a visionary who developed this model was Katherine Bauer. She had an affair with Louis Mumford in which he was a complete and utter jerk. We can talk about that later. But Katherine Bauer saw the social housing in Europe. She called it modern housing. She was smart. She was like, we're not going to get this done without a coalition. She teamed up with trades and other unionists in Philadelphia. They created a labor housing congress. And they, along with the PWA, were advocating this model of modern housing. The real estate industry did not want this. And so they shut it down. And how did they do it? They did it by creating the fundamental basis of public housing in the United States. That had two characteristics. One, limiting the amount of money that could be spent per unit to ensure that it was always going to be bare bones quality, very different from what they did in Vienna and other European cities. Two, the eligibility was restricted to the poorest of the poor. This was a real estate strategy. It was not the left that wanted to means test non-market housing for the poorest of the poor. That's what real estate wanted to do, so they would not have to compete with the government for housing middle income, lower middle income people, working class people. So that is what the real estate industry achieved in a series of legislative moves, starting with the Housing Act of 1937 all the way through the 1940s. I think there is an erroneous view that public housing was great when white people lived in it, and then it became terrible and neglected when people of color moved in. It was sabotaged from the very start. The real estate industry knew what it was doing, and it prevented, legally prevented American public housing from resembling in any way the best aspects of the European social housing model. So insofar as we think of today, public housing as being low-cost housing in which only lower income people live, yes, that was the victory of the real estate industry. And that is why I defend to this day mixed income housing. We should build, I think, initially disproportionately social housing for extremely low and very low income people because they are in the greatest need. But we should not replicate the real estate industry's model of only having very poor people living in this housing. That is a political disaster. Anybody who believes in Medicare for all understands why we shouldn't means test social housing. Now there is, in Vienna today, there is an income cap. It's about 49,000 euros for a family. Vienna's the salaries in Europe are lower, the social benefits are higher. We should probably think of that as something in the neighborhood of $100,000 household income here, probably even higher than that in the Bay. What my friends in Vienna have explained to me is, if you're in Vienna, you're a young person, you have an okay job, you are basically going to decide, do I want to spend more of my money on a private market rent, or am I going to get something a little more basic, but still beautifully designed and in social housing? And that's the kind of choice that I think we should be providing here. I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to say just a couple more quick things. This fantasy, this idea that I've been saying, oh, sounds so crazy. Daniel, what's wrong with you? Oh, Sao Paulo, I don't know, those hot-headed Brazilians, they can protest more than we can. I don't know. Vienna, that's Europe, it's different, Mozart, different character, different culture. The social housing movement here has really landed in the last few years. A big part of this is a report by Saoirse Gowan and Peter Cooper from the People's Policy Project that in many ways kickstarted a discussion. But around the same time, a few years ago, even the Center of American Progress put out a report pointing to Vienna as well, saying we needed millions of units of public housing in this decade. The Center for Popular Democracy has just put out a report. The Homes Guarantee Tenants movement has put out a briefing book calling for a massive expansion of social housing. There's the work that Shanti and Tenants together are doing. The Alex Lee bill in California, I think it could be improved, but it's a big marker. Just today, Janice George, newly elected council member in DC, dropped a Green New Deal for Housing Act, calling to create a social housing authority in DC. The idea of a Green New Deal for housing and a Green New Deal for social housing was present in Bernie Sanders' campaign platforms, both for climate and for housing. Of course, Bernie and AOC introduced the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, leading to Chuck Schumer fighting for tens of billions of dollars for public housing. We have a really interesting idea coming out of the Urban Democracy Lab, the idea of a social housing development authority. That would be a federal authority, but it could be done at the state or city level, that acquires low income housing that's in danger of being bought up by commercial landlords, and instead buying that up and turning it into social housing. And just the other day, they released another report on social housing 2.0. So we are in the midst of this big, frothy, exciting discussion. And I think, as Shanti alluded to, we need to kind of get the politics right, make sure that as the first bills start to pass, the first institutions get built, we do this on really sound footing. And I think if we do, we can imagine a new housing reality in this country, around the world, fighting climate change, keeping people safe in homes that they will all be excited and happy to live in. That is a dream that we can achieve, and I think we can achieve it very soon. Thanks.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. And thank you, Shanti, for your thoughts earlier. I really am excited about the questions that are coming in. And I think it's time that we can kind of move in that direction. Daniel, you do have a very specific question in the Q&A around the Nelson Mandela Project. So do you have access to the Q&A? Can you see the Q&A and how to type your answer?
I can.
Okay, if you can figure that out, I think there's a very specific question about.
Yeah. The answer, I'll just say, the answer is anti-Dodges, although I believe there's some state funding in there as well, but it's the anti-Dodges model.
All right. Thank you, Meg. So I want to take advantage of the questions and appreciate Cyrus and Ari and Alex and our department chair, Lakshmi Ramasu, remaining coming in with questions. And I'm going to take them a little bit out of order, just as a way of kind of getting us situated. Maybe actually we can start with Alex Ferrer's question. I think I'll try to go from like some of the more general questions down, and we'll end up back. Don't worry, Cyrus, we're going to end up back in 2053 and back in California, but we're going to sort of start high. So, Alex Ferrer asked this question about, do you think that progressives have learned the right lessons from what, again, Shanti called the betrayal of public housing? And I think, Daniel, you've alluded to a lot of the different sort of lessons that are coming with. And so, again, this is a question for, again, both of you, with your lens as either people who write history or read a lot of history and know the history yourselves, but also, again, activists and thinkers that are trying to operationalize history and learn from the past. I mean, do you think that from what you're seeing, again, particularly on the ground in movement spaces, in cities and in jurisdictions that are considering it, are the right lessons being taken about whether, again, how to produce it, what social housing, quote unquote, is, who it's for, as Daniel mentioned, right, which is a big question. Are we taking the right lessons from history here?
I guess I can try to take a stab at that. I mean, I just think I don't think this is necessarily like an insurmountable problem at all, but I think that what I've experienced is sometimes there are disconnects between like really smart, fiercely intelligent progressives and who are thinking through this and learning this history. I mean, just as I have, but also I think it's important to kind of maybe connect people a little bit more. That might be a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, but it's not just the past. I mean, this is very much like, I think this is kind of similar to a point you made about missing pieces of history, Alex, but on Twitter the other day. But it's also very much that the past is present. The neighborhood I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 2018 or so, not that long ago, the public housing that some of my friends lived in, my childhood friends lived in, was demolished. The tenants were not really given relocation. Actually, fewer units were built than the original units that had been there. They were turned into sort of mixed income, quote unquote, townhouses. that a lot of low income people just simply could not access at their area median income level. So people didn't come back. That was 4 years ago in a community that I grew up in, right? And so, there are still tenants having fights. I do wish Theo were here to talk about NYCHA, but that was something that was that's a whole thing. There are still fights for public housing happening now, right? And so actually having that conversation about why, this is a huge issue in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, for example, where tenants are actually, even though they may have habitability issues, all sorts of disinvestment issues with their public housing, they are still fighting to stay. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as we work together for social housing to ask ourselves and to ask them why that is. So to kind of get back to Alex Ferrer's question, I don't think that I don't think we fully gelled that understanding yet. But I think that we can, and there's also a lot of great scholarship coming from folks like Akira Drake Rodriguez, from John Baranski, who's actually a historian and a member of the Housing Stability Fund and Oversight Board with me, talking about these histories, both here in SF, in California, in Atlanta, all over, that also kind of, it's important to know the history of that, but they're framing it as actually public housing, even with all the challenges and that were thrown its way, all the betrayals, was still very much an important political vehicle for working class people. And to a degree, it very much, despite all that it's faced and everything, it still is, and people are still fighting for it. So that's really the one kind of thing I just think that we could all collectively develop a better understanding about when we're thinking about what social housing looks like in the future.
Thanks. I would just add, all of that is right. I think the short answer to the question is yes, in the sense that we have, as I was saying, a massive ecology of new proposals, for the most part developed in pretty close consultation with movements that have learned the lessons. Again, the original failure was not the fault of the housing progressives of the New Deal, it was the fault of the real estate industry. Sorry, but there you go. You can go back and reread Modern Housing in America by Gail Radford for all details. Beyond that, I think what Shanti said is right. We have, I don't think we should see social housing as a replacement of the various things that people have now. We want to build a lot of new housing. I think we should use a social housing model. And I think we have to find ways to protect the people who are in precarious housing now, their right to stay put. The beauty of the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act is that it's a vision and a concrete plan for saving the public housing that currently exists. And I hope that we will build enough new social housing, that there will be a lot of options. And if folks want to move across the street, if people live in a public housing complex now that was built a long time ago and want to move into an ADA compliant unit across the street where the elevator is bigger, where they have more room to get around, more support for their special needs, that should be an option that we should create. But nobody should be getting kicked out of their housing because of a model that I or anybody else cooked up in a room.
Thank you to both of you. And so now I'm going to flip. We're going to flip from the past to the future. And so Lakshmi Subramanian asked a really good question about sort of how to be sure that we're adapting our whether it's a design vision or our model or our imagination to the world that we actually have right now. Or again, chances are the majority of folks, are not going to be going to work in a factory in many places, except for places where, of course, they are. Whether it's, again, knowledge economy workers, students, folks working in Walmart or in an Amazon factory, part of it is it's kind of adapting to the current situation. And part of it is my question, and I read, at least how I'm reading into her question, is also making sure that ultimately our vision is really modern and contemporary. The heart that I think is often lost too much in the United States. The United States is a very old-fashioned country. The old world is much more modernist than the new world. I think we often have a tendency to really look backwards and get really, but how do we, Red Vienna, if you go to Vienna now, it's a very much future looking kind of things. And Daniel, you brought up Green New Deal and sort of decarbonization. So again, what do you think for both of you are the keys to making sure that we're both designing for the now and we're designing for the future, and not in some ways we're learning from history, but not trying to recreate 1930 something, which is something that many communities in the United States are trying to currently recreate. Or maybe 1952, which is what I think a lot of places are trying to read. Everybody's trying to go back to 1952 in America, and
Sure.
that's not going to happen.
So, I mean, I think the short answer is we can absolutely do this. And, you know, you go to Vienna, like you want a literal bike themed social housing complex, like they've got it. You want a feminist social housing complex, they've got it. You think, whoa, what about our elder, you know, friends? They might be suffering from dementia. Actually, they built a social housing complex for people suffering from dementia in Vienna. And the remarkable thing about it is that they have a kind of rainbow style coloring on all the interior balconies. And the reason is that they had seen research finding that exposure to kind of vibrant colors seemed to help those suffering from dementia to attenuate their symptoms. And what does that exemplify? It's that if you have a non-market system with an ecology of nonprofit developers who are able to build housing based on social needs, not market needs, to sound old-fashioned, maybe use values and not exchange values, then the limit is simply human creativity. And I mean, to some degree, the spreadsheet, but it's like, you know, and there are other examples, of course, across Europe, as many of you will know, all kinds of co-living arrangements. Architecture now allows the construction of buildings with flexible walls that can be adjusted depending on the household size. They're building social housing along those lines in Germany. So I think the core underlying insight is this. Right now, you go to Uptown Oakland, and what do you see? A whole bunch of luxury condo towers that all look damn same. And I've been inside them because I once had the idiotic idea of renting in them. They look the same. It is just a giant cookie cutter box with appliances that are, you know, imitating suburban appliances to fill a space that's much smaller. And it's ridiculous. And if you look at the housing models in Vienna today, which are not built based on a kind of, I guess you call them slash and build kind of market style that we see in the United States, you have far more splendid and interesting housing design. I'd also point out that the winners of the Pritzker Architecture Award last year, whose names just popped out of my head, two French architects, their specialty is retrofitting decrepit public housing and making it far more beautiful and more energy efficient. So I would say really the cutting edge, or we could go to Norwich, England, where last year or a couple of years ago, the Sterling Prize, England's greatest architectural prize, went to a passive house, kind of townhouse style social housing development, which fit a kind of like 2-3 story high urban environment. So the cutting edge of green architecture right now really is very often found in affordable and in social housing. We're not going to house the entire country in suburban homes with solar panels on the roof, a Tesla in the driveway, and a battery pack in the garage. That's not what's going to happen. And if you want something else, dense, mixed use, mixed income, your best bet is to look at the social housing models in Europe, where they have emancipated architects, designers, and communities from the most cruel dictates of the American housing market.
Yeah. I'll add in terms of just, you know, from like the California experience or the tenant experience as well. It's like, for some reason I was thinking about, you know, for example, the fact that most of my day job hasn't actually been social housing related during COVID. It's been about eviction, it's been about rent relief, and it's been about job precarity in this new economy, right? Where we supposedly have, you know, ultimate flexibility, but what that really means is low wages. What that means is oppression at work. And you can see even in what's happening at Amazon and Starbucks, a movement against that. Like, I'm working with tenants who are Amazon workers who can't get enough rent relief to stay in their homes, right? So this is very acute, I think, particularly in California, where we have unfortunately seen with initiatives like Prop 22, a rollback of labor rights, which has affected people's ability to live in their communities, to be, you know, our crisis means that we've got people, you know, commuting into San Francisco from Tracy or even farther, 3-4 hours one way or another, which is also horrible for the climate, you know, to get to their jobs. So, I mean, I think that does kind of feed back into, you know, what having to really like work with labor, organized and unorganized, having to work with workers, and having to have how we design the social housing, how we build the social housing, who lives in it, et cetera. Like, I think it really does have to be, because of the way that the knowledge economy or the gig economy or whatever, the fact that the freedom that it claims to be offering is not actually freedom, it's making people's lives worse. And more people are falling into that precarity, including during COVID, where you have a very racialized, very class-based job recovery, right? Jobs have not recovered for a lot of people. And those are the people that social housing needs to house the most at the end of the day, right? That's the priority, right? And we build out from there. So it just, yeah, I guess I had tackled the question from a different perspective, but I think it is very much like we really need to be hand in hand with labor, tenants and workers as we try to figure out, you know, how we're going to do this in California.
So there's some really good questions that I want to come over. Just want to give one, I think maybe perhaps a little bit of pushback for Danielle. Just the one thing I would offer in the American context is that if we're talking about the great retrofit, and I love this French example when I lived in Paris, is right when they had first started, you know, bolting balconies on the outside of some of the HLM buildings there. It was really kind of an inspirational opportunity. But that's really France retrofitting what it has. If the United States of America is going to retrofit what it has, we have a lot of suburban homes full of lots of different people across the class spectrum, including folks that are driving Teslas and are not driving Teslas. And I think it's important that if we are going to create a social housing vision for California or a social housing vision for the United States, it can't be a social housing vision for San Francisco. San Francisco can choose a Vienna model, but Antioch, but Brentwood, but Modesto, but Stockton, but all the places where, again, I've done a lot of research over the years, that kind of, you know, extremely urban, always based on density, always based on, you know, certain maybe types of rental housing isn't necessarily, I think, going to fit. But I think there is a social housing future that involves things that look like homeownership, that involve things that look like smaller 1 to 4 family homes on suburban lots. There's an aspect of the retrofitting suburbia and the social housing movement that I think can come together. Now, have we figured out how to put those together? I don't think so. I'm hoping that it's certainly an area where I think my work and my research and my thinking is going over the next few years. And I'm just hoping that we can get there. And so I just wanted to make sure to kind of put that.
Look, I don't disagree with any of that, but just to be clear, if you want an American architect retrofitting suburbia to win a Pritzker Prize, which I would love, then you have to put up public investment. I mean, that's the only point. It's not that we're only allowed to retrofit towers in the park. The point is that we have to put public investment in dignifying the homes that people live in, retrofitting them for climate change. And if you do that, we're going to get spectacular results.
Yeah. And well, and that's actually a good segue into the next set of questions. And so we have 2 Megs, wonderful. Meg Heisler asks a question that I think is also similar a little bit to one that Cyrus asked earlier. So Cyrus asked the question about revenue neutrality and what it specifically means with regards to reinvestment in social housing or how people are imagining it. And then Meg asked a question about sort of the relationship between municipal debt or the financing of debt and how it relates to the kind of landlord-tenant relationship that we're going to have, right? So yeah, I would love for both of you to think a little bit or answer these questions about the kind of underlying financial model. How important it is, if there are any kind of key lessons that you think, again, whether it's rooted in the question of using municipal debt for this, whether it's rooted in the question of fiscal neutrality, quote unquote, or any other lessons from the kind of world of finance you think are particularly important. And is this maybe the point, Shanti, where I out you as somebody who worked in high finance? I'm doing this not because it's really important. I think we need more people who have experience on Wall Street in this space. And also because I want to make sure that you all know that you need to take Shanti really seriously, not just because she's smart, but because she's experienced.
Well, that was my first job out of college, and it is about 9 years in my rearview mirror. So I'm ashamed to say, you know, I have drank beer since then, so it's starting to fade a little bit. But you were just reminding me that I really need to read this wonderful book by Destin Jenkins called The Bonds of Inequality, and I have not had time to read that yet because that's actually incredibly pertinent to this question. I'm still pretty bullish on bonding in general, but you know, I'm still kind of thinking about the pitfalls of it. But I mean, I think that's what we need to do, but also it's not easy to do. But I do want to remind folks that a few years ago, the state of California did pass a $3 billion bond for housing. The problem is we somehow managed to forget to spend what, 2.7 billion out of that 3 billion? Was that it? That just came out last. So
yep.
We have bonding capability. I also just, you know, I mean, it's trite to say that we have the 5th largest economy in the world, but we have the 5th largest economy in the world. So, you know, there are things I'm not optimistic about, like the fact that we still live in a Prop 13 state for 12 years longer than I've even been alive. But, you know, I think we can get a lot more creative about the financing than we have so far. But I'm not going to offer any like insanely great insight about bonding right now. Although I have been hearing from lots of different folks across the country, people have been reaching out to me with their bond ideas. So I'm very excited about that. But I do think municipal bonds, or actually state bonds, can absolutely be a part of it. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of, we're going to need to put a lot of money into this. That is just true. And everyone knows this. It's not easy to build low income or any income housing right now. So it's not going to be, you know, something that we can start off with revenue neutrality off the bat in terms of how we, I guess that's getting into the next question. Someone will save that answer. But I also think, our bigger challenge is, as California, is we actually haven't really been very imaginative or even been willing to like roll back, you know, things that are hurting the public coffers, like Prop 13, like the GAN limit. I'm going to say it out right now, like things that just seem completely, they're from another time. They're relics of another time. They're relics of a right-wing taxpayer revolt, which we will absolutely have to overcome if we're going to build social housing for anybody. So that's all to say, like, and then thinking about that bond thing, I'll stop rambling for now, but I actually think that at least for California, it's like, there are even tools that are close enough to us, but they're just a little far away right now, that we can start thinking about how we put more money into this system. So that's my very California specific rant. Awesome.
Okay, 4 quick points. One, the housing building should not be used as collateral for the loans. That's a problem with the blueprint idea in New York State. But you know, governments issue general purpose bonds, and there's a way to have a bond that doesn't put the tenants of the building on the hook for the repayment of that debt. Second point, look, you know, solving the housing crisis and upgrading the built environment to deal with climate change, especially for like the poorest quarter, third, or even half of Americans, is not necessarily going to like quote unquote pay itself back. And we shouldn't get trapped into that argument. The entire green transition is basically an upfront cost problem. You know, you put a ton of money into a new economic system, into a new energy system, et cetera, and then eventually some of that money comes back. But when you're dealing with low-income housing, that housing has been abandoned, it's been neglected, it's been put in poor repair. It's not just a question of swapping out a boiler and replacing it with a heat pump. Often you have to do substantial other work. So yeah, building new passive housing is a great idea. It costs basically nothing to operate. Go forth, and that will be cheaper in the long run, same as an electric bus. But a huge amount of what we have to do, the vast majority of people who live in homes that already exist, not homes that have not yet been built, obviously. And so there is going to be a big upfront cost. We should not impose the logic of a payback. So, you know, government that issues general purpose bonds is essentially holding their taxpayers as collateral. That's okay. You can pay that back with income tax, but you can't put low income people on the hook for the payback of investments in their well-being. That just will not work. I don't know if I have 4 points. The third point is that, again, we can afford to do this. Shanti said, 5th largest economy in the world. Again, the United States public investment is about 38% of its GDP, its total economy. In the Netherlands, it's 43%. You go to France, over 50%. The US could spend $1 trillion a year on infrastructure, green infrastructure, every single year, and that would take the US from in the high 30s to the low 40s of public investment as a share of GDP. So we have to do that. You can get creative. You can create a national investment authority. You can do all kinds of good stuff. There's lots of ideas floating around, green bonds, you know, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, we have to spend more. Okay, then final point, the 4th point. We do actually have a kind of logic for this, and that is the idea of direct investment to frontline communities, environmental justice communities. California pioneered this. So, you know, from cap and trade revenues, the 35% go to frontline communities. The Biden administration has embraced this with the Justice 40. New York State has taken this on with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Housing is obviously at the nexus of climate, environmental injustice, and income inequality. So we have right now already a logic for investing money into communities that need it for green housing. And I think that will be a very important argument for us all to make. If this EJ principle of targeted investment has taken hold, let's use it. And actually, affordable housing, sustainable communities is in the California bill. Now we need to juice the amount of money that goes in. But we have the fiscal capacity to do it. We have all kinds of creative instruments to do it, and we already have a legal framework to do it.
One way I think that, you know, I find to be useful maybe to think about some of these questions is that, you know, the question about whether to bond or not to bond, that's a technical question. That's a policy question. Again, it has to do with sort of like, the question is, okay, well, it depends on how you do it and depends on how you attach it and who's paying, et cetera. And it's a really good subject to debate. revenue neutrality or fiscal neutrality is an ideological question, because everything that we have is subsidized. You know, my corn and my tortilla is subsidized. My mortgage income, my mortgage in this house is subsidized. We subsidize so many roads, everything is subsidized. And so the idea to say that the housing for the majority or the 2/3 of the society that might be able to live in this housing should or not be subsidized, that's an ideological question that I think sort of sends us down ideological debates where we're having debates on ideology and not on the actual program. And I think that that's actually one of the things that's really important, I think, for us to separate in all manners of not just housing, but in all manners of urban systems, right? You know, are you debating the merits of a particular technical way of doing things, which is a really important thing to do, or are you arguing on ideological terms? And I think that's one important way of thinking about it. Again, we're starting to see some really nice praise. Thanks to Bill Almerline, our wonderful kind of co-host. I really appreciate it. Renee, Moya, thank you for that sort of shout out to Daniel, the enthusiasm that's coming through the chat. I just want to say we're now getting to the end of our second of 3 events. The quality of questions that we've done this has been far better than any other set of webinars that I have ever participated in. So just really appreciating the audience for what you all bring to the table. We've been, Daniel and Shanti have been name dropping various things that they read. I promise that we're going to include all of these things, including Eve Blau's book in the list, including Destin Jenkins' book, which I also need to read. Somebody was supposed to send that to me for review and they never did. So just again, really appreciate it. Want to encourage folks to stay tuned, to come back to us on Friday for Gordon and more conversation, really, especially about the context. So let me just ask sort of put the final 2 sets of questions into a package. And thanks again to both Megs for asking questions. So the first is a question, and this is maybe more of a Shanti question, but Daniel, I imagine you'll have some thoughts as well, from Ari Cohen. He's asking, what are the lessons from what we're seeing on the ground in places for sort of building social housing into these municipal long range efforts, right? Whether it's growth strategies, rezoning, like how do you start to seed, how do you start to build these ideas so that if and when and as funding comes around, it is possible to really sort of jump. And then the second question, and again, just because we're going to run out of time, I want to put them up here now, is Cyrus asked a question that brings us back to AB 2053 and the Alex Lee bill. And so if there are ways that you think that, you just want to put out there that things you think that are important to say now about how the bill is going or maybe should be going, this would be a great opportunity. And other than that, I'm going to leave you two for more or less the last word. So thank you all, both of you, for coming and for really taking the time. It is truly appreciated.
Thanks. I guess I can take a stab at, do you want me to answer both questions at once? All right, I'll try my best to do that and give Daniel enough time. But, ideas on how, I think, in my experience, the thing is, I guess my experience is probably tilted one way in that, like, what we do at Tenants together is we're just trying to organize more unorganized communities of tenants, right? Particularly the most vulnerable ones, low-income communities and communities of color. Have we organized all of them across California? Not yet. Are we trying to get there? Yes. So I think that will probably inform, what priority communities are in the long run in order to establish social housing. And then, of course, those are the parts of our membership that are established, that are organized in places all over the state, who are starting to think about it and what it means to them. So that's probably going to be, I don't mean to be glib, but that's probably going to be a big part of the answer to my question. But of course, there's going to be other folks with other opinions, and particularly in terms of like what we think about, which is something I'm trying to incorporate more into my thinking and don't have a great answer for right now. But of course, it's like the way that climate change is going to shape California specifically. Obviously, we're not throwing in the towel on rolling it back, but there's only so much of it that we can roll back. And how much is that actually going to define who is going to be able to live where, right? We're already seeing crazy, we're already pushing legislation at Tenants Together. I am, that addresses the fact that, for example, cooling is not a habitability issue in the Central Valley. Or, that we're working with tenants who are, getting rent gouged, even though they have state of emergency protections, because they're in wildfire zone, or they have literally been affected by wildfire, burning down their homes themselves. So that's definitely something that's on my mind in terms of when we start thinking about what long-term planning for social housing is, even to answer the simple question of where we're going to put it. those are the two things that I think about the most, which again, I have not figured it all out. I'm sorry, everyone. Not a super satisfactory answer, but those are the two things that are on my mind right now in terms of at least at Tenants Together, the work that we do statewide. So I wish I had maybe I'll think about that answer more. Maybe I'll try to pop some of these out on Twitter. We can figure this out, Alex. To the point about, 2053, yeah, we haven't taken an official position as Tenants Together on it. That's something that's been a huge part of why I'm doing so much engagement with our membership as to how they think through this. We're really struggling through all of our different ideas of social housing together as 50 groups across the state. But that's to say, there's a lot in this bill, that's very promising. But in terms of the gap, the gap right now, or the thing, I don't even want to call it a gap. The thing that we need to figure out is this revenue neutrality, low income prioritization question. And that is a lot to put on any piece of legislation to solve, right? We are not going to solve this overnight, but it is something that we actually need to start talking through, talking more on, because at the end of the day, it's tenant groups want to fight for social housing. They need to know tenants want to fight for social housing, but they need to know that it's going to deliver for them. And so that's my short answer. I could go on about this for an hour separately. I'm happy to talk to folks. I'm probably already going to talk to you, Alex, about it later, and Alex Lee, Assembly Member Lee, I'm sorry. But that really is the main point. When I go to talk to tenants who are really struggling right now, I have to deliver. I have to say this housing is for you too. And that's the thing we need to keep working on. Daniel?
Thank you. I wake up every single morning, as the last few years, grateful that Shanti is leading tenant organizing in California, not by herself, obviously, but that Shanti is doing this work with her gigantic brain, which could fill the entire atmosphere under normal conditions, and just the sheer dedication and knowledge. So thank you, Shanti. And thank you, Alex, for hosting and putting us together, and Gordon and all the folks at San Jose State. Very quickly, we have to protect land for social housing. So, protect land from the market. There is all kinds of land out there. Don't sell it off for quick and dirty development deals now. Hold the line. Hold the line. People need to be able to live near jobs, near services. We also have to create good communities and suburbs, but the most valuable land, everybody's going for it. Hold the line. Cities have to do that. The role of labor, Alex Sandsberg, late-breaking question, is essential to building this. You don't have a winning progressive coalition on big ticket items in modern politics without support from labor. The trades are very powerful. They have a huge role to play in this. My older brother is a grip on movie sets in New York City. He works with his hands, does construction on movie sets. He lives a good middle-class life for one reason: the union. The one and only reason he lives a good life is the union. The best part, in my view, my favorite part of Alex Lee's bill, reading a summary of it, was this consistent references to the role of labor crafting beautiful, long-lasting structures. That's actually, Viennese social housing was mocked by German modernists in the 1930s, because the German modernists thought, oh, these weird pastiches, it's too elaborate. All the stonemasonry, it should just be square, austere boxes like we built in the suburbs of Frankfurt. Well, that's a good joke on those German modernists of the 1930s, for God's sakes. But the Viennese housing was built to use the skills of the craft laborers. So we got to do that again, 100%. The value of craft is one of the few things we have left in this digital hellhole. Final point, revenue neutrality. Yeah, there's no way in hell you were going to build significant, extremely low-income housing with cross subsidies from the middle class. Anybody who's ever studied anything in the world in which there has been a spreadsheet knows how that thing is going to break on the ground when there is limited money and there are cost overruns, which we should embrace. Why not cost overruns? Everybody deserves an extra hour for lunch, So it's insane. No, revenue neutrality is not, as Alex pointed out, it is not an actual reality in anything resembling the housing market or any other market. Nor is there some God-given need for revenue neutrality in a freaking housing program in the middle of a climate emergency in California, which is getting slammed every single day by this problem. So no, nobody needs revenue neutrality. We have a lot of money in California. Focus on the problem, focus on the need. That's how we get through our own everyday lives, and that's how we should get through the housing and climate crisis as they converge. Shanti nailed it. The idea of building a new housing model centered on justice in which tenants are not active, enthusiastic participants because they know they're going to benefit from it, that is what science fiction is. So let's fix this bill and put the needs of the folks who need the benefit first. And Shanti, thank you again so much for courageous and unrelenting struggle in this fight.
Thank you, Daniel, for helping me expand my brain these many months.
Just want to say thank you. Thank you to Gordon and to the fabulous Lou Jimenez who've been on the ones and twos today. Again, hopefully we'll see many of you on Friday. I just tossed in the website for the IMS. Please get in touch if you have ideas. In particular, again, whether it's ideas for other types of issues that we could do a deep dive in addition to social housing. Nothing too wonkish or too technical nothing is too wonkish or too technical for us. We're happy to sort of do it. And again, part of what we're trying to do is to help people provide a stronger foundation of their knowledge, the stuff that none of us really learned in high school growing up in the United States about how anything gets made or anything gets built. That's really what we're dedicated to doing. We're hoping to be able to develop curriculum down the road to really help younger folks learn about this so that you're actually learning about how, none of this is surprising because you've learned about all manners of building housing and all models of building housing at an earlier age. And in particular, also, I welcome any comments or feedback or pushback about any of the content we have. We are trying to we are thinking about other sessions that we can have as the sort of liberal homeowner on the panel. One of the things that I like most about Alex Lee's social housing bill is that it includes a homeownership component that nobody, including Alex Lee, talked very much about. And I think I know why that y'all haven't talked about it, and I want to talk about it. So if anybody wants to be a panelist on a homeowners meets social housing panel, please come talk to me. Also hoping to maybe potentially convince Rashida Phillips and Paula Slitting to come talk about sort of radical Afrofuturist housing futures and social housing and all other manners of housing futures. So really appreciate the time. Thank you so much to everybody. Everybody send their best wishes and love to Sia Weaver in New York City. Hope those tenants get on the bus and hope that we can have Sia and the New York City example here at SJSU and the IMS in the near future. Thank you all live from Oakland. It's Tuesday afternoon. And thank you all, and have everybody be wonderful and be safe out there.
Thanks all.
Bye.